Harold Thompson had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for over 20 years. The retirement community was meant to be his peaceful retreat, a place where he could tend to his vegetable garden, enjoy quiet afternoons on his porch, and chat with neighbors who, like him, just wanted a little serenity in their golden years. But peace had become a thing of the past ever since Judith Miller took over as HOA president. Judith wasn't like the previous presidents. Those before her had been firm but fair, ensuring the community remained clean and orderly without meddling in people's personal lives. But Judith, she had turned the HOA into a personal kingdom, ruling with an iron fist wrapped in a cashmere glove. At first, it was little things. Petty letters about a garden gnome being out of aesthetic compliance, or fines for leaving a porch light on too late. But when Harold received a notice about his new garden fence, things turned personal. Harold's wife, Eleanor, had passed away the previous winter. The garden had been her pride and joy, a lush haven of roses, tulips, and lavender. After she was gone, Harold promised himself he'd keep it thriving in her memory. But there was a problem. The deer had other plans. Every morning, Harold would step outside with his coffee, only to find trampled flower beds and nibbled stems. He tried everything, repellents, motion-activated lights, even a homemade scarecrow. Nothing worked. So, after careful thought, he invested in a small decorative wrought iron fence, no more than 3 feet tall. It was black, elegant, and matched the HOA's guidelines perfectly. Or so he thought. 3 days after installation, a bright yellow violation notice was nailed to his front door. Unauthorized modification. Remove immediately. Harold scoffed. Unauthorized? He had checked the HOA rulebook twice before ordering the fence. He marched straight to the HOA office, gripping the notice in his wrinkled hand. The HOA office was housed inside the community clubhouse, a place that once hosted potlucks and holiday parties, but had since become Judith's personal throne room. Harold found her behind a pristine mahogany desk, sipping tea from an expensive-looking china cup. "I assume you're here about the violation," she said, barely glancing up. "You assume, right?" Harold replied, setting the notice on her desk. "That fence follows every guideline in the HOA handbook. There's nothing in there that says I can't have it." Judith sighed, setting down her cup with a deliberate clink. "The guidelines state that all exterior modifications must be pre-approved by the HOA board." Harold gritted his teeth. "Then why wasn't an issue when my neighbor installed a similar fence last year?" Judith smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Things change, Mr. Thompson. We're raising standards for the community." Harold felt his pulse quicken. Raising standards? This wasn't about the fence. This was about power. "I'm not taking it down," he said firmly. Her expression darkened. "Then you'll be fined $200 per day until it's removed." Harold knew she expected him to back down, like so many others had. But he had spent a lifetime standing up for what was right. He wasn't about to let a petty dictator push him around. He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving Judith to stew in her own arrogance. Over the next week, the fines piled up. Harold ignored them, confident he'd win this fight. But then, something strange started happening. Late one night, as Harold sat on his porch sipping a glass of bourbon, he saw movement near his front yard. A shadow darted past the streetlight. Frowning, he switched on the floodlights. 2 people stood at the edge of his property, dressed in dark clothing. One held a clipboard, the other a measuring tape. Harold's got twisted. "Hey!" he called out, standing up. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" The 2 figures scattered like roaches, disappearing into the night before he could get a good look at them. He didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, another violation notice arrived. This one claiming his fence was 4 inches over the legal height limit. Harold stared at the paper, his hands trembling with rage. He had measured that fence twice before installing it. Judith was making things up. That afternoon, he installed a motion-activated security camera on his porch. If they want to play dirty, he'd be ready to... IT didn't take long for his camera to catch something shocking. The very next night, Harold's phone pinged with a motion alert. When he checked the footage, he saw a man in a black HOA polo creeping up to his fence with a ruler in hand. Harold zoomed in. The man placed a ruler above the fence line, lifting it slightly to fake a height violation. Then He snapped a picture on his phone. Harold's hands clenched into fists. The HOA was fabricating evidence. This wasn't just about some minor rule. It was deliberate harassment. That was the final straw. Harold wasn't just going to fight this. He was going to end it. The next morning, Harold woke up to a stack of envelopes crammed into his mailbox. Each one bore the HOA seal, and as he flipped through them, his stomach twisted. Fine number 1, $400 for an unauthorized structure. Fine number 2, $200 for obstructing community aesthetics. Fine number 3, $500 for failure to comply with removal orders. Final notice. Failure to resolve this matter within 48 hours will result in further enforcement measures. Harold exhaled sharply, gripping the papers so tightly they crinkled. Further enforcement? What did that even mean? Before he could process it, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered, and Judith's syrupy voice oozed through the line. Mr. Thompson, I see you still haven't removed that fence. This is your final warning. Harold clenched his jaw. Or what, Judith? You gonna call the governor? Silence. Then a chuckle. You'll see soon enough, she said, and the call ended. A slow, creeping sense of unease settled in his chest. Something wasn't right. Harold didn't have to wait long to find out what further enforcement meant. That afternoon, as he sat on his porch reading the newspaper, a black SUV rolled slowly down the street. It stopped right in front of his house. 2 men in dark uniforms stepped out. Their shirts bore the words, Westwood Private Security. Harold narrowed his eyes. He had never heard of them before. One of the men, broad-shouldered with a buzz cut, approached his porch with a clipboard. The other stood back, arms crossed, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Afternoon, sir. Buzz Cut said, flash of what looked like a badge. We've been contracted by the HOA to ensure compliance with neighborhood regulations. Harold folded his arms. Didn't know the HOA had a police force. Buzz Cut smirked. We're not police, sir. Just community enforcers. We specialize in resolving compliance issues efficiently. There was something in his tone that made Harold's skin crawl. Efficiently, huh? He said. Well, you can efficiently get off my property. Buzz Cut's smile faded. We'd rather not escalate this. Harold took a slow step forward. Try me? A long silence stretched between them. Then the second man, the one with sunglasses, muttered, He's not worth the trouble. Buzz Cut gave Harold a long, measuring look before nodding. Have a nice day, Mr. Thompson, he said, and the 2 men got back into their SUV and drove off. Harold stood there, heart pounding. This wasn't some HOA dispute anymore. Judith had hired muscle. That night, Harold barely slept. At 2 a.m., his security camera pinged an alert. When he checked the live feed, his blood ran cold. The same black SUV was parked at the end of his driveway, engine running. 2 figures sat inside, watching, waiting. Harold's fingers hovered over his phone, ready to call the cops. But before he could, the SUV's headlights flashed twice. Then it sped away into the night. Harold knew what that was. A warning. The next morning, he walked down to Ed's Diner, the local breakfast spot with a retired crowd gathered each morning for coffee and small talk. As he slid into his usual booth, a few of the other regulars, old-timers like him, gave him knowing looks. Marge Peterson leaned in, lowering her voice. Saw some men in a black truck outside your place last night. Harold's eyes flicked up. You saw them? Marge nodded. Not the first time, either. Couple nights ago, they were parked outside Bill and Nancy's place. Bill, sitting across from them, grunted. Yeah, HOA's been leaning on people who don't fall in line. Nancy and I got fined for having a blue door. A blue door? Harold repeated. Bill's face darkened. Judith told us it wasn't in harmony with the neighborhood's color palette. We had that damn door for 10 years. Harold set down his coffee cup, mind racing. This wasn't just about him. Judith was running the HOA like a mob boss, using fines and intimidation to keep everyone in check. Well, enough was enough. Harold didn't have many living family members, but he did have a nephew, a former Marine who now worked in private security. That evening, Harold gave him a call. Hey, kid, Need some advice. His nephew, Ryan, listened as Harold explained the situation. When he was done, Ryan let out a low whistle. Sounds like Judith hired some shady contractors. I'll do some digging. The next day, Ryan called back. Uncle Harold, you were right. Westwood Private Security doesn't exist. No website, no registered business license, nothing. They're a ghost company. Harold felt a chill. So who the hell are they? Ryan sighed. Best guess? Some ex-cops or military guys looking to make a quick buck. Probably unlicensed, which means what they're doing is illegal. Harold tightened his grip on the phone. He wasn't just dealing with crooks in suits. He was dealing with thugs in uniforms. And that meant it was time to bring in the big guns. The next morning, Harold drove straight to the local law office of Claire Whitmore. Claire was the kind of attorney who specialized in HOA nightmares, and she had a reputation for tearing corrupt boards apart. Harold laid out everything: the fake fines, the harassment, the fabricated violation photos, the mystery security firm. Claire flipped through the stack of violation notices and smirked. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Harold's eyebrows lifted. That's so. Claire nodded. The HOA has no authority to hire private enforcers, especially ones that aren't licensed. If they've been issuing fines based on fake evidence, that's fraud. Harold leaned forward. So what do we do? Claire's smile widened. We hit them where it hurts. Harold left Claire's office with a fire in his gut. This wasn't just about his fence anymore. This was about exposing Judith and taking back his community. The next step? Find proof. With Ryan's help, Harold began digging. Within 24 hours, they uncovered something big. Westwood Private Security wasn't just unlicensed. It was a front. The company's registered address led to an abandoned strip mall. Judith had personally approved over $50,000 in HOA payments to this fake security firm. The money was disappearing. No invoices, no service contracts, just withdrawals from the HOA's account. And then the smoking gun. Ryan found an old news article from 3 years ago. Local HOA president caught an embezzlement scheme. The woman in the mugshot? Judith Miller. She had been the HOA president of another community where she was caught funneling HOA funds into personal accounts. She dodged jail time with a plea deal, but she was barred from ever running another HOA. And yet, here she was, running Oak Ridge Estates. Harold's blood boiled. Judith wasn't just corrupt. She was a criminal. Harold wasn't one for drama. But this called for a show. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread. People were fed up. Judith stood at the front, her usual smug expression in place. The first order of business, she announced, is continued non-compliance from Mr. Harold Thompson. Harold stood up. Not today, Judith. The room went silent, with slow, deliberate movements. Harold walked to the front and placed a thick folder on the table. You want to talk about violations? Let's talk about yours. He flipped open the folder and held up the mugshot. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This is you, isn't it, Judith? Harold said, voice steady. Judith Miller, convicted of embezzling HOA funds 3 years ago. A woman barred from running another HOA. Judith's face went white. You used our HOA money to hire fake security goons. You've been issuing fraudulent fines. And worst of all, you've been stealing from us. A murmur turned into angry shouting. Is this true? Someone yelled. Judith stammered. This is a misunderstanding. But Harold wasn't done. Luckily, I brought someone who can clear this up. The double doors swung open. Claire Whitmore stepped inside. In light of recent discoveries, she announced, I've filed a class action lawsuit against Judith Miller on behalf of Oak Ridge Estates homeowners. The room erupted. Judith's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then the police walked in. The officers moved in like clockwork. One of them, a sergeant Harold had known for years, walked up to Judith and held out a piece of paper. Ms. Miller, we have a warrant for your arrest. Judith stumbled back. Wait, Fraud, embezzlement, and harassment, the sergeant continued. And considering your history, the judge isn't going to be lenient this time. The room watched in stunned silence as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. "You can't do this." Judith shrieked, "I'm the HOA president." The sergeant smirked. "Not anymore." As the officers escorted her out, she locked eyes with Harold. "This is your fault," she hissed. Harold tipped his hat. "Sure is." The doors shut behind her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone started clapping. And just like that, the entire room erupted in cheers. With Judith gone, the HOA board collapsed within a week. An emergency election was held, and for the first time in years, the residents of Oak Ridge Estates had a say in their leadership. Fines were voided. Judith's financial records were audited, and the fraudulent security firm shut down for good. Judith's house went up for sale. Rumor had it she tried to find another HOA job, but with her arrest all over the news, no one would hire her. Meanwhile, Harold, he sat on his porch, watching as a group of neighbors hammered a no soliciting sign into the HOA office lawn. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like home again. Things changed after Judith. The HOA introduced new rules. No president could serve more than 2 years. No fines without a community vote. No outside security firms without resident approval. And Harold? He kept his fence. In fact, after the dust settled, something funny happened. Neighbors started putting up their own fences. "Hope you don't mind, Harold," Bill said one afternoon, grinning. "Turns out fences are pretty useful." Harold chuckled. "Guess that makes me a trendsetter." The two old men sat on Harold's porch, watching the neighborhood heal itself. And for the first time in a long time, Harold took a deep breath of crisp morning air, smiled, and knew he had won.